Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nelufar Hedayat of Doha Debates and our esteemed panel.
It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming back. My name is Nelufar Hedayat. I am the correspondent for Doha Debates, a documentarian, filmmaker, and journalist. Next to me is Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, a partner at Denton. Then it's Kimberly Randle, the CEO of Fair Supply, and Heather Fischer, Senior Advisor for Human Rights Crimes at the Thomson Reuters Special Services. Can we just have a round of applause for them? So we've hardly got any time at all to tackle one of the most important, insidious, difficult to manage, and hard to detect problems, probably in the supply chain network. So you've got your work cut out for you. We're going to start off with a quick fire round of questions, just to spice things up after lunch, eh? So I'm going to go around to each one of my guests and ask a very important question. Why bother? This problem is difficult to solve. The people affected are hard to detect, see, and notice. And more to the point, it's incredibly difficult and embarrassing for the brands, the supply chains, companies, organizations, and individuals involved. So why bother? Why is it important to tackle this now? Ambassador John.
I think there are three reasons. One is human dignity, that everyone has inherent value. And if we believe that, no one should be forced to work. But there's also an economic case that forced labor interferes with markets and capitalism. Companies shouldn't be able to profit by not paying their workers. And then the third reason would be that it's illegal, and there's a legal mandate on companies to dig in and do the right thing.
Kimberly?
I would agree with John in that it is a legal requirement. It is a legal requirement in the criminal law, and also there's mandatory reporting obligations globally for companies to actually identify, assess, and address risk of modern slavery deep within their supply chains. So addressing these issues are increasingly becoming a cost of doing business, as they should be.
Heather Fischer.
Yeah, I think if you hail from the international relations space, as I do, you're asking the question, does this even meet the existential? And John already talked about human dignity. People are created with dignity and respect. Here in the United States, we have principal values that people have the right to freedom and justice and to prosper. And John also talked about the economic securities. You know, we can't compete with countries who leverage forced labor in their global supply chains, but also for someone like me who's now working in the national security space, we know that these actors don't just traffic human beings. They're mixed up in all sorts of types of exploitation. And so I think if we can't get you on it's the right thing to do, hopefully, we can get you on the economic and the national security angle as well.
So the second of my quick fire questions, why you? Why have you specifically and particularly been drawn to this? And it's a question we can all ask ourselves in the audience as we hear these responses.
You know, I've been doing this work for over 20 years full-time in a bunch of different capacities. I think the reason I'm drawn to it is because it is an achievable end. Human trafficking, forced labor is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's not like an earthquake or a tornado. There's actually practical things that we can do, and I think we can see dramatic change.
I think I've always had a sense of justice, and in terms of respecting fellow human beings and advocating for those who are unable to advocate for themselves. I see that as an educated woman, a responsibility to advocate for those who can't advocate for themselves.
There's a lot, I think, wrapped up in this question, but for me, I'm fourth generation committed to justice and humanitarian issues, so I have big shoes to fill. But I will be very honest that I didn't initially want to know anything about human trafficking. I thought that it was a very dark issue. I was very paralyzed by it. And it wasn't, I'm embarrassed to say, until 10 years into my career, where I learned that if it wasn't people who were thin-skinned enough to care to actually jump in to make a difference, that the victims and survivors that we now have the privilege of working with and serving would never get the resources that they need. And so that's a piece of it. And on the forced labor piece, I'll never forget what it's like touring garment factories in Cambodia and talking to women who were not just forced in forced labor, but also being sex trafficked. And I think I'm not so far removed that I don't remember those days. So that's why for me.
So now we understand a little bit about our panel and our mission, what we're trying to do here. It's time to tackle the issues at hand in their specific expertise. We're going to be talking about the importance of data, cooperation, and transparency. So let's just start with the idea of cooperation, Ambassador John, if we can. You've worked a lot with governments, government partners. You're a lawyer by trade. You've worked on these cases. How important is it to lead from the front when it comes to organizations working with governments and trying to tackle this thing, not necessarily from the behemoth or the high level, but from scrappy young, maybe NGOs or lawyers like yourself?
Yeah, I've worked in government for a fair amount of my career, as well as 2 different NGOs on this. Cooperation is critical, but it's important to know what we're cooperating towards. Like, what is the end? And not just having more meetings, but actually using collaboration as a tactic to achieve a goal. And the reality is we need to work with governments around the world so that they can build out their public justice infrastructure, their delivery system of justice and social services. Many of these countries have made broad, big international commitments that they do not have the capacity to enforce. And because governments are not following through, they're not doing the job that they're committed to do in terms of identifying victims and holding perpetrators accountable and getting services to survivors, we're seeing a shift that is a shift from government to business, for business to be responsible for human rights issues. This year, we just got a report last week that the global estimate of trafficking has skyrocketed from 40 million to 50 million people. So we're going in the wrong direction. No matter what everyone thinks about the SDG goals, we're moving away from success, not towards it. And so we need to take seriously the fact that if there are 50 million victims in the world, and governments last year reported identifying 90,000, that is, governments all over the world put together have identified 90,000 victims. We're identifying less than half of 1% of all the victims on the planet. That is a failure. And so I think we need to collaborate in order to do something differently.
You were both nodding your heads. I want to give you an opportunity to build on that.
Please.
I think business has a very important role in addressing modern slavery and the exploitation of humans. But you can't fix what you can't see. And so it's absolutely critical for businesses to have a method of actually identifying where exploitation is existing. And that's generally deep within complex global supply chains. It's unlikely that if resources are directed at, say, the first tier of the supply chain, it may be so, but it would be unusual that that is where human trafficking and other forms of severe exploitation would be found. So unless businesses have a way of actually ensuring transparency over their supply chain and visibility over their supply chain, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to identify exploitation and human trafficking. And you just simply can't fix what you can't see. So before companies turn to addressing this issue, they need to be able to identify it adequately.
Heather?
I think that's why I'm in the private sector now. I know that we can do more. We're certainly trying to do our part, but I'll just say John and I are both former US government, probably recovering senior officials. And we knew we did try to leverage every authority, every tool in our toolbox, every sanction, every withhold release order that was available to us on this particular issue, but we knew there was only so much we could do. And really, I don't know if I'll have time to really get into it, but the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that most companies are grappling with right now, we knew that that was a piece of the puzzle. We needed companies to commit not just to ESG writ large, right? But this very narrow focus on forced labor. There's so much that we can do to systematize protecting vulnerable people. And it is going to take the big four and the data companies like Thomson Reuters to come together to collaborate.
Okay, the journalist in me is itching to get out. So I'm going to ask a slight difficult question. What does failure and success at your organizations look like when it comes to tackling this issue or advocating for it? So very personal here, but what does failure and success look like?
Well, failure is not an option. And John's worked with me for a number of years now, and I think, failure for us is to stay in our silo. Failure for us is to not figure out a data feed for ESG, forced labor, environmental crimes, wildlife trafficking. So we're working, what we think is the solution and what we think is the answer is to bring a Thomson Reuters solution. And that's not just the Thomson side, that's really working with our reporters on the Reuters side who see global crimes each and every day and mining that information that could be actioned by companies and really building out the supply chain to the end tier.
Great answer. Your failure is one of your successes.
Not
I love it. It's a brilliant answer. Ambassador John, if I could come to you, what does failure in this look like and what does success look like?
Yeah, failure looks like people continuing to be exploited around the world, and we lose all the opportunity of their innovation, of their ability to become entrepreneurs. Success for me, as we work with companies at Dentons, is to help them identify and make sure they've got the right governance architecture in place to deal with the issue of human trafficking in their supply chains, both forced labor in their supply chains, but sex trafficking in their workforces as well. And to help them map their supply chain using tools like Kim created at Fair Supply. And think through not just their first tier suppliers, but using their procurement data to drill down to figure out their entire supply chain, which will be required, not just as an advisory or recommended provision, but as the EU move towards their due diligence system, every company is going to be responsible for what their supplier did, all the way down to the raw materials, and what may be the biggest shift in vicarious liability we've seen ever. And so I know it sounds dramatic, but the reality is there is this new mandate. So we help them map their supply chains and then do a risk assessment. Where are the risks? How do we prioritize those risks? How do we think through what the interventions should be when there's a problem? Whether it is cut and run and perhaps create other human rights challenges in that community, or maybe something where we mitigate or remediate, or maybe it's just clauses in contracts or an indemnification agreement. But where on that continuum of mitigation is the appropriate move for your company at this time? And helping companies figure that out is going to allow them to do all the other pieces they need to make sure there's a grievance procedure and we can move on to the others. But what's critical and what's successful is when companies know their supply chain and are dealing with it.
Kimberly, what about you?
So innovation and big data can certainly identify where the risk of exploitation, severe exploitation is in a supply chain. But companies need to use that data to embed it in both procurement processes and investment decisions. So when companies can identify where the risk is, success really looks like addressing that risk, assessing that risk, and actually actioning that risk is embedded operationally, not just in policies, but in operational procedures prior to purchasing and investment decisions being made, that human rights and severe exploitation is taken into consideration as a business risk, and any operational grievance mechanisms are those that apply to external stakeholders.
So let's just stick with that and let's tackle the issue of transparency. Transparency doesn't mean accountability, does it?
Transparency is the first step in accountability, because you can have accountability for the wrong things. You can have the best policy to address these issues in the world, and a company can be accountable for that. But unless it's embedded and available to external stakeholders and workers that these issues are actually affecting, unless you're accountable for the right thing, we're never going to successfully address this issue. And that's accountability over the right things is certainly what is going to move organizations in the right direction to address modern slavery.
Do you want to come in on that, Ambassador?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Transparency is the first step. Kim, I like the way you said that. And transparency has been the framework that we've had for the last 12 years, is we've asked companies to disclose what, if anything, they're doing to deal with forced labor in their supply chains. But now, with Europe in the lead, we are seeing a new system that's moving from transparency to diligence, from disclosure to diligence. And what we're going to have to deal with is now a mandate on companies to know their supply chains and to deal with the forced labor abuses in it. And it's something we all have to take very seriously, because the reality is there's forced labor in most of the products that we use every day. And it doesn't mean a company's done something wrong when they find forced labor in their supply chain any more than if they find a sexual harassment case in their company. They just have to deal with it. They have to find that issue, deal with it properly, and build and train so that there are fewer of those problems in the future. And I think we have to move towards a place where companies are a part of the solution. And if they do know about it ahead of time, then we can hold them accountable, certainly. And when I was a prosecutor, we had a lot of fun doing that.
You can Google how much fun he had and how successful he was.
I mean,
after this.
I think it's just really important, and we're starting to see a global trend in terms of organizations being held to account over their transparency. There's increased litigation over greenwashing. Certainly in Australia, claims have been made against companies that are misleading and deceptive. So a decade of disclosure, if organizations are not accountable for what they're disclosing, is essentially over. And I think we're just at the very beginning of that era.
I'd like to add to that too. So transparency is one thing, and accountability, which I've never been accused of not holding somebody accountable for forced labor, but I will say I don't think it's enough. I think that we need to mature as a field. This has to be, as I said before, systematized into a way where we move it out of just risk and compliance or even our corporate social responsibility to the C-suite. And just like companies are making their commitment to the environment, to diversity, equity, inclusion, I would love for them to make a commitment to eradicating human trafficking and forced labor from their supply chains. If they did that and touted it instead of being afraid of what's under the hood, right, and knowing what their supply chain looks like, and actually now they don't really have a choice if they're going to do business here in the United States, but they should at least get credit for it, right? They should be talking to their investors and saying this is a top priority for us, and to tell that to their consumers. And I think this next generation in this war for talent, I'm so impressed for them because they will demand it. We're moving away from the baby boomer materialistic generation that didn't want to know where it's coming from, that wanted it faster and cheaper. And young people today are asking, is it direct trade? Is it organic? Do this pair of jeans have cotton produced by forced labor in it? And I actually think they're willing to pay a bit more, and it doesn't cost that much more actually to pay a fair wage to the worker.
I love this, turning a problem into a promotable moment for the organization. I thinking ahead.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a movement by asset owners and fund managers who are really pushing organizations, C-suites, to address forced labor in their supply chain. So we have the legislation coming as one tailwind, but also pressure from investors as the other.
I'll leave it at that because with the next 2 minutes, 9 seconds we have, I really want to tackle this issue of data and understanding how data is not a panacea, but a tool within solving this problem. So Heather, I want to come to you again because I want to focus on this. It sometimes sounds to me as a journalist when I'm trying to decipher, promote, and get the stuff you're saying out here on this panel to the public, it sounds like data sometimes can be a panacea, as though it's going to solve everything. Once we know, we can do. But that isn't necessarily the case, is it?
Well, I think it's a combination. So I've learned content is king. And in a world where you can have the best tools and technology, if you don't have that content to fuel your tool, then you don't have the answers that you want to provide. So I think combining data and analytics and data scientists who I get to work with day to day, and really kind of opening up the back end of the data and making good sense of it, and trying to figure out what is it you're trying to solve for. And that's been a big challenge for us. And Department of Defense came to us many years ago and said, we need to map out our entire supply chain. It can't be done, but you have to do it. And so that was a tall order, and that was really used for the national security space. But when I came in, I said, oh, I could totally repurpose this, right, for addressing forced labor and global supply chains. And that's what I do day to day, is to think about how do we take what's already been cultivated to protect the homeland and to protect human rights.
In the last few seconds that we have, Bailey, I'd love to give you an opportunity to maybe round off the conversation we've had with a takeaway for our audience. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Ambassador John.
Yeah, I think the takeaway is that the time to prepare is now. It's not 2 years from now. It's not after a complaint is filed with your company. Now's the time to begin that process of understanding what your supply chain looks like and how to engage it.
I think as organizations move forward, especially in addressing environmental issues, what we're going to see is the intersectionality of the E and the S of ESG and how correlated they are. And so addressing them simultaneously is extremely important.
I mean, my colleagues all raised great points. I would just say, as we're trying to mature as the anti-trafficking field, we invite you to help us, and we need that private-public sector partnership. And it's not just going to be Thomson Reuters alone. I mean, we work with so many firms, and I think being a force multiplier to the NGOs, to government, civil society, across the board, we talk about it a lot, but we actually need to do it.
Could we please have a round of applause for my wonderful panelists, Ambassador John Cotton Richmond, Kimberly Randle, and Heather Fischer. Thank you so much. Off we go. Thanks.